Everyone thinks they know how the Opium Wars started. Britain got the Chinese hooked on drugs, China fought back, Britain won, end of story. It's the version taught in a 10-minute classroom slide. It's the version that shows up in half the documentaries on this subject. And it is almost entirely the wrong question to be asking. Because the real question is not, why did Britain sell opium? The real question is, why did Britain need to? And once you start pulling on that thread, the entire story changes shape. This is not a story about a drug. It is a story about an empire that ran out of options, a civilization that believed it needed nothing from the outside world, and a collision between two systems of power that neither side fully understood until it was too late. So let's actually get into what historians consistently get wrong about this war, starting with the thing almost nobody puts first, even though it should be first. The first thing they get wrong is where the story even begins. Most accounts start the clock in the 1830s, right before the fighting. That's like starting a story about a house fire in the middle of the blaze and never mentioning the gas leak. The real starting point is nearly a century earlier, and it has nothing to do with China at all. It has to do with a beverage. Tea had become, by the mid-1700s, something close to a national addiction in Britain, except nobody called it that because it was legal, taxed, and respectable. It was baked into the rhythm of the day. It was what kept dock workers upright during brutal shifts, what soldiers carried into camp, what the aristocracy served at every function that mattered. And there was exactly one country on earth that could supply it at scale: China. Britain wasn't importing a luxury, it was importing a dependency. And dependencies have a way of dictating policy long before anyone admits it out loud. Here's where it gets uncomfortable for the standard narrative. Britain had almost nothing China wanted in return. Woolen cloth didn't sell in a climate like southern China's. British manufactured goods were, from the Qing perspective, unremarkable next to silk, porcelain, and lacquerware that China had been perfecting for 1,000 years. So the tea had to be paid for the only way China would accept. In silver, up front, no substitutions. And for decades, that's exactly what happened. Ships loaded with silver sailed out of British ports, and came back loaded with tea, and the accounts got more lopsided every single year. This wasn't a fringe problem, it was a structural one, and it sat on the desk of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, not just the merchants at Canton. Which brings us to the second thing that gets flattened in the popular version, the idea that Britain simply decided, one day, to become a drug empire out of greed. That's not what happened. And what happened is that Britain tried, repeatedly and sincerely, to fix the imbalance through diplomacy first. And China said no every time, for reasons that made complete sense from inside the Qing worldview. The most famous of these attempts was the Macartney Embassy of 1793, and it deserves far more attention than the footnote status it usually gets. Lord Macartney arrived with an enormous, carefully curated collection of British technological achievement. Telescopes, clockwork automata, a planetarium, examples of the newest scientific instruments in Europe. The goal was to demonstrate that Britain was a civilization worth trading with, as an equal, not a supplicant. It didn't work, and the way it failed tells you almost everything about the century that followed. The Qianlong Emperor received the mission courteously, admired the gifts as curiosities, and then rejected every substantive request Britain made. No expanded ports, no permanent embassy in Beijing, no reduction in tariffs, none of it. His response, later transcribed and sent back to King George III, has become one of the most quoted lines in the history of diplomacy, that the Celestial Empire possessed all things in abundance and had no need for the manufactures of outside barbarians. Read today, it sounds almost mythic in its confidence. At the time, it wasn't arrogance for its own sake. China's economy in the late 18th century was, by most estimates, the largest in the world. The emperor wasn't bluffing about self-sufficiency. He was stating an economic fact from where he sat. The tragedy is that this fact was about to stop being true, and nobody in Beijing could see the shift coming. So diplomacy failed, and Britain still had the same underlying problem: a currency drain it could not sustain. This is the third thing that gets misrepresented. The idea that opium was Britain's first move, it wasn't. It was closer to a last resort, arrived at only after every legitimate channel had been tried and closed. The British East India Company had been cultivating opium poppies in the Bengal region since well before the crisis peaked, largely for a modest regional trade. But by the early 1800s, it became increasingly clear that this crop, unlike wool or tin, was something Chinese buyers actually wanted badly, regardless of what the Qing government said about it. The company leaned in, and it leaned in hard. What's rarely discussed is how deliberately the mechanics of the trade were built to keep the company's hands technically clean. After China formally banned opium imports, the East India Company stopped shipping the drug directly. Instead, it auctioned raw opium to independent merchants in Calcutta. Merchants, who then carried it to the South China coast on fast, purpose-built clipper ships and sold it into smuggling networks that moved it inland. On paper, the company was simply growing and selling a crop within its own territory. What happened to it afterward was officially someone else's business. Everyone involved knew exactly what this arrangement was. It was plausible deniability engineered at an industrial scale, and it worked precisely because nobody with the power to stop it wanted to. The volume tells the real story better than any speech could. In the final years of the 18th century, a few thousand chests of opium were reaching China annually. By the 1830s, that number had multiplied many times over, and the effect on China's silver reserves was the mirror image of what had been happening to Britain's. The flow reversed. Silver that had been pouring into the Qing treasury for a century started pouring back out. And the damage wasn't abstract. China's tax system and much of its internal commerce ran on a dual metal structure, with silver used for large transactions and government levies, and copper coinage used in everyday life. When silver became scarce and its value against copper spiked, ordinary people who earned in copper suddenly needed far more of it to meet silver-denominated obligations. A currency crisis that started in a counting house in Canton ended up in the household budgets of farmers who had never seen a foreign trader in their lives. Layered on top of the economic wound was a human one, and this is the fourth point most retellings skip entirely. What this trade did inside Chinese society itself. By the 1830s, opium use had moved well past the coastal elite who had first adopted it. It had spread into the ranks of soldiers, into the civil bureaucracy, into ordinary households in the southern provinces. Estimates of addiction rates in the hardest hit regions run shockingly high. This wasn't a moral panic manufactured by the court for political convenience. Officials were watching functioning institutions hollow out in real time, and the emperor on the throne, the Daoguang emperor, understood with total clarity what was driving it. This is where the standard narrative finally catches up with the part everyone already knows, the destruction of the opium at Canton in 1839. But even this moment is usually told wrong, or at least told thin. The man who carried it out, Commissioner Lin Zexu, is often reduced to a hardline enforcer who triggered a war through overreach. That description badly undersells who he actually was and what he actually tried to do first. Lin was one of the most respected administrators in the entire Qing bureaucracy, with a track record of successfully suppressing opium in other provinces before he was ever sent to Canton. And before he confiscated a single chest, he wrote a letter addressed directly to Queen Victoria, appealing not to power but to conscience. He pointed out, correctly, that opium was illegal inside Britain itself, and asked how the Crown could justify permitting its merchants to sell in China what it forbade at home. It is one of the more remarkable documents in the history of international diplomacy, and it received, as far as the historical record shows, essentially no direct response. Only after that appeal went nowhere did Lin act. He demanded the surrender of all foreign opium stocks in Canton, and when merchants stalled, he sealed off the foreign trading enclave and cut its supply lines until compliance followed. Over more than 3 weeks, more than 1,000 tons of opium were destroyed, dissolved in trenches of lime and salt water and flushed out to sea. It was one of the largest coordinated drug destructions in recorded history, and it was carried out with a striking amount of procedural care, including a formal apology offered to the spirits of the sea for the pollution about to occur. Whatever else it was not the reckless act of a rogue official. It was closer to a nation defending itself the only way it had left, after every diplomatic and legal option had already been exhausted. Here's the fifth and probably most consequential thing that gets misrepresented. What happened back in London when news of the destruction arrived. The dominant emotion in Parliament was not embarrassment over the drug trade. It was outrage over destroyed property, and a very calculated argument emerged to reframe the entire conflict. A crucial legal maneuver made this reframing possible. Britain's superintendent of trade in China had persuaded merchants to hand their opium stocks over to him on the Crown's behalf just before the destruction took place, which meant that when Lin destroyed it, he was, in the strict legal sense, destroying property that now belonged to the British government rather than private traders. That technicality became the foundation for the case that this was an assault on British sovereignty, not a drug seizure. The debate that followed in Parliament was genuinely fierce, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets, because it proves the war was never a foregone conclusion. A future Prime Minister stood up and delivered one of the more scathing condemnations a sitting government has ever received from its own benches, accusing the state of fighting to protect a trade that no decent person could defend. He lost the vote by a narrow margin. The faction that favored war argued with total sincerity that this was fundamentally a matter of free trade and national honor, not narcotics, and that framing carried the day. It is worth sitting with how much history turned on that single parliamentary vote and how thin the actual majority was. Once the fighting started, it stopped being a contest almost immediately, and that's the sixth thing worth correcting. The idea that this was a hard-fought war rather than a demonstration of a technological chasm. The Qing military was still equipped largely for an earlier century, with wooden war junks and matchlock muskets facing down iron, hulled steam vessels and modern naval artillery. Engagement after engagement ended in lopsided losses for Chinese forces, not because of any lack of courage, but because of a gap in industrial capacity that had opened up gradually and then suddenly became impossible to close. By the time British ships were anchored within striking distance of Nanjing in 1842, the Qing court had no real path left except to negotiate under duress. The resulting Treaty of Nanjing set the template for everything that followed for the rest of the century. Hong Kong was ceded outright. 5 ports were forced open to British trade on terms Britain dictated. A massive indemnity was imposed, on top of the compensation demanded for the destroyed opium itself, which meant China was effectively billed for the very drug that had been poisoning its own population. British subjects in Chinese territory were placed outside the reach of Chinese law entirely. This was the first of what would later be called the unequal treaties, and the label is almost too polite for what the document actually represented. But peace didn't hold, and this is the 7th point that's routinely underweighted. The first war solved nothing structural, so a second one was almost inevitable. British merchants had expected the newly opened ports to produce a flood of demand for their goods. It never really materialized because the underlying problem from a century earlier hadn't changed. Chinese consumers still didn't want most of what Britain was selling. The trade imbalance that had driven the opium trade in the first place was still sitting there, unresolved, just temporarily obscured behind gunboats and treaty language. It took less than 15 years for tensions to boil back over, and the trigger, when it came, was almost absurdly small. A dispute over a Chinese-owned vessel with an expired British registration, boarded by Qing officials looking for suspected smugglers. Britain treated the incident as a national insult regardless of the legal technicalities, and a second war began, with France joining under its own separate pretext. This second conflict escalated further than the first, and it happened while the Qing dynasty was already fighting for its life against an internal uprising of staggering scale, a rebellion that would eventually claim tens of millions of lives and remains one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Fighting a foreign war and a civil war simultaneously left the court with almost no leverage. Anglo-French forces eventually marched on Beijing itself, and in one of the more deliberately symbolic acts of the entire century, British forces burned the Emperor's summer palace complex to the ground over 2 days, destroying centuries of accumulated art, manuscripts, and cultural heritage. It wasn't described at the time as retaliation for lost trade. It was framed as punishment for the mistreatment of captured negotiators, but functionally, it was a message about what resistance would cost, sent in the most permanent way available. The 8th thing worth correcting is the tendency to treat these 2 wars as a closed chapter rather than an opening one. Chinese historiography has a specific term for the period that follows, stretching from this era into the mid-20th century, the century of humiliation. And that's not a dramatic flourish. It's a functional description of 100 years during which foreign powers repeatedly extracted territory, trade concessions, and indemnities from a state that had lost the ability to say no. The internal rebellions that tore through China in the decades after the Opium Wars weren't a separate story. They were downstream of the same pressures. Treasuries drained by indemnities, currencies destabilized by the silver outflow, and a government whose authority had been visibly, publicly broken by foreign warships. Cause and effect here are not subtle. The 9th point, and one almost entirely absent from popular accounts, concerns who actually grew the opium and what it cost them. The poppies weren't cultivated by faceless institutions. They were grown by Indian farmers under a system of licensed, closely controlled cultivation, paid fixed and often exploitative rates, with real penalties for selling outside official channels. Land that could have grown food was redirected toward a cash crop destined for a foreign market, and when harvests failed elsewhere, the consequences were catastrophic. The regions where this cultivation was concentrated still show measurable long-term effects in development indicators today. These farmers rarely appear in the story at all, even though the entire trade depended on their labor and their coercion. The 10th and final point ties the story together in a way that most retellings avoid because it's uncomfortable, rather than because it's obscure, where the profits actually went and how permanent that money became. Fortunes made through opium trading in this era didn't stay confined to a single generation of merchants. They were reinvested, diversified, and laundered through legitimate finance, shipping, and institution building until the origin became a footnote nobody mentioned in polite company. Trading houses founded on opium profits still exist today as major corporations, family fortunes with roots in the trade, fed directly into some of the most recognizable names in later American and British public life. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a documented, traceable line from narcotics smuggling to what later generations simply called old money. There's an 11th point that rarely makes it into these retellings, and it complicates the morality play considerably. The fact that the Qing court itself was deeply divided over how to handle the crisis, and that division reveals a level of internal debate most accounts don't credit China with having. One faction inside the bureaucracy actually argued for legalizing and taxing opium outright, on the reasoning that prohibition clearly wasn't working, that smuggling networks and corrupt local officials were the only ones profiting from the ban, and that the state might as well capture some of that revenue instead of losing all of it to the black market. This wasn't a fringe position. It was argued seriously, at the highest levels, by officials who weren't indifferent to the suffering opium caused, but who doubted prohibition could ever actually contain it. The opposing faction, the one that ultimately won out and sent Lin Zexu to Canton, argued that legalization would only accelerate the spread of addiction and normalize something that was actively destroying the social fabric. The point isn't that one side was obviously right. The point is that the Qing court wasn't a monolith blindly stumbling toward disaster. It was a government actively wrestling with a genuinely difficult policy question, arriving at a principled answer, and then discovering that principle alone couldn't withstand an ironclad fleet. It's also worth being honest about the fact that China's vulnerability wasn't purely a story of foreign aggression against an innocent victim. The Canton system itself, the framework that had regulated all foreign trade through a single port for the better part of a century, was riddled with its own corruption. The merchant guilds who served as intermediaries between foreign traders and the imperial government were frequently in debt to those same foreign traders, which compromised their ability to enforce restrictions even when they wanted to. Customs officials skimmed enormous sums off the top of trade revenue, money that was supposed to fund defense, and administration but instead disappeared into private and imperial pockets long before it could be used to modernize a navy or reinforce a coastline. None of this excuses what came afterward, but it does mean the empire that faced down British warships in 1839 was already weaker from the inside than its confident diplomatic language suggested. The gap between China's self-image and its actual institutional condition had been widening for decades, and nobody with the authority to fix it had much incentive to admit how bad it had gotten. There's a 12th point worth raising, because it reframes what the East India Company actually was, and most people badly underestimate this. It wasn't simply a trading firm with government connections. It was, for practical purposes, a sovereign power in its own right, maintaining a private military larger than the standing army of Britain itself, administering justice across huge stretches of Indian territory, setting tax policy, and waging wars under its own authority long before the Crown formally took over Indian governance. Opium wasn't a side business for an organization like this. It was structurally central to the entire enterprise. Revenue from opium auctions helped fund the military operations that secured the territory where opium was grown, which in turn generated the revenue that funded further military operations. It was a closed financial loop, and removing opium from that loop would have destabilized the entire architecture of British power in India, not just a trading post in Canton. Understanding the company this way changes how you read the whole conflict. This wasn't a government reluctantly tolerating a rogue trade. It was closer to a corporate military hybrid whose core business model happened to be narcotics, operating with enough political influence in London to shape the actual foreign policy of the British state when its revenue stream came under threat. It's also worth pausing on how avoidable much of this actually was, because the tragedy of the Opium Wars isn't just the violence, it's how many off-ramps existed and were missed. If the Qianlong Emperor had granted even modest concessions during the Macartney mission, the economic pressure that eventually produced the opium trade might have been defused decades earlier. If the East India Company had accepted a slower, more balanced approach to opening Chinese markets instead of demanding unrestricted access on its own timeline, the confrontation might have been delayed long enough for either side to adapt. If Parliament had sided with the anti-war faction in that narrow, contentious vote, the first shots might never have been fired at all, and the entire subsequent century might have unfolded along a completely different track. None of these alternate paths were taken, not because they were unimaginable, but because short-term institutional interests on both sides consistently outweighed the harder, slower work of compromise. That's a pattern worth sitting with, because it isn't unique to the 19th century. So what does all of this actually add up to? It means the popular version of the Opium Wars, good empire versus bad empire, drugs versus morality, isn't false so much as it's dramatically incomplete. The real story is about a civilization convinced it needed nothing from the outside world, colliding with an empire convinced it could not survive without a beverage. It couldn't produce itself, and a trade imbalance that neither side was willing to solve through compromise. Opium wasn't the cause, it was the instrument. The cause was silver, tea, pride, and a refusal on both sides to bend until bending was no longer optional. And the aftershocks didn't stay in the 19th century. The lesson China drew from this era, that weakness invites domination, still visibly shapes its foreign policy and its posture toward the rest of the world today. There's also a strange historical symmetry that's hard to ignore. 2 centuries after British opium devastated Chinese communities, synthetic opioids manufactured in China now flow into Western countries, fueling an addiction crisis of their own. Whether that's coincidence, consequence, or something in between is genuinely debated among historians, but the parallel is too precise to dismiss outright. Historians get 5 things wrong most consistently. They frame this as a story about drugs, when it was really a story about trade architecture and civilizational collision. They understate how much of Britain's aggression came from desperation rather than confidence. They erase the Indian farmers whose coerced labor made the entire trade possible in the first place. They treat 2 wars as an isolated episode instead of the opening act of a century-long unraveling, and they leave out where the money went afterward, as if opium profits simply evaporated instead of quietly becoming the foundation of respectable modern wealth. Understanding all of that isn't just a history lesson. It's a way of understanding how empires justify themselves, how desperation gets dressed up as principle, and how the consequences of a trade war can still be felt 200 years later in places nobody at the time could have predicted. If you made it all the way through this one, drop a teacup in the comments. I want to see how many of you stuck it out to the end. And if stories like this are your thing, subscribe, because there's a lot more history hiding behind the version everyone thinks they already know.